talking about any framework code first migrations. Show of hands real quick. Who uses C# in the room? About half. All right. So this is primarily geared towards C# users because it's a specific ORM for C#. There might be other ORMs that also do this. Brian might have some thoughts towards that later if you want, because I think I spoke to him about it. So. Real quick about me, I love programming. I'm the core organizer of the Global Game Jam South Bend site. An entrepreneur at heart, just not in practice. I've been in the urban adventure and it's amazing. If you have not done it, you should. I've released an Xbox 360 indie game. It was so fun seeing it up on the Xbox arcade on the channel. It was awesome. And if you've heard of Soylent, I drink that somewhat regularly. I thought that's probably the most weird thing about me at this point. Does anyone know what Soylent is?
People.
It's a meal replacement shake, not like I don't know. There's other one. This is supposed to replace all of your meals. Like it has all of your minerals, all your vitamins, has your daily calorie intake, has everything. So theoretically, you could just drink that on its own. So that's pretty interesting. So don't drink it all the time though.
But for people who have no taste buds, is that
it doesn't taste too bad. Like when you first try it, it tastes a little bit like paper mache. But it kind of grows on you. All right. So real quick, I'm going to say what I'm going to be talking about. So first, I'm going to go very quickly what an ORM is. Then I'm going to say what code first migrations are, because that's what the main point of the topic is. And then I'm going to show off. Most of the talk is going to be a demo, and then I'm going to leave time for questions. But while I'm giving the demo, if you have any questions about what I'm typing or doing at the moment, just interrupt me and I'll help you out. All right, so WTF is an ORM, guys. ORM stands for object-relational mapping. So the idea is that it basically helps you take care of the boilerplate between database and code, as you can see on the screen, right? So. It can help you prevent from writing SQL if you're not really into that. It helps you lets you do unit testing on code rather than SQL. So because that code gets translated to SQL. ORMs are very nice. There seems to be debate. Some people don't like them. Like when I was looking up more information about this, some people are like, "Oh, ORMs are the worst." Some people are like, "ORMs are great." I'm kind of in the ORMs are great point or camp. But yeah, there's lots of choices. Pretty much every language has an ORM at this point, at least one. I was looking at C# ORMs. There's like 10 at least, and I only knew of 2. All right, so what are code first migrations? So the term code first comes from the idea that any framework, specifically this ORM, any framework, has 3 different ways where you can map to the database. You can either do database first, so the idea is that you write your SQL and you create your database, and then you can help generate the POCO objects, or the plain old C# objects that will be used in the database first implementation. There's model first, so if you like dragging around diagrams, you can create your database that way, and then it'll create it. But code first is kind of where Entity Framework is going, and Entity Framework 7, that's not out yet, is much more heavily invested in code first. And doing code first lets you do this cool thing with migrations. So I remember a couple years ago when we'd be interviewing people, one question that I always asked interviewees, because I was really curious for the answer, because I didn't have the answer, was what's a good way to version control your database and lock it to your source code? Because there's like different source repositories for database, but they're disjoint. They're not part of your code base normally. They're normally in their own repo, and even if they're in the same repo, there might be problems in keeping the database in lockstep with whatever version of the code you're on. So code first migrations helps with that. All right, so I'm going to go into the demo. So what I want to do first is I want to show my app that I've been working on for a couple of years now. And I want to show how it works with any framework. So, oops, I forgot to load up SQL. All right, so as you can see, when I zoom in, there are no databases currently, all right? So now I'm going to run Social Desktop, the app I've been working on, and hope that this demo does not crash and burn. So as part of the loading right now, it's spinning up, it's basically going through all these different migration files that Code First Migrations has created, spinning up the database, and putting it at the place it needs to be. So if we look back at here now, we'll see that this Social Desktop DB now exists where it did not before. And we'll see that it has lots of tables. And we'll see that it has a migration history that shows all the different migrations that ran. So basically I had the database when I first created the app. I just had maybe like a wallpaper class. And then I added more to it. To give a quick idea of how the app works, this wallpaper is taken from, I just closed it. The app kills the production version while it's running. But this wallpaper is probably from Reddit/r/imaginary landscapes. So it scrapes Reddit and other sites and basically brings wallpaper, the URLs into my app, and then it will serve the URL from Reddit in my app. So if the actual image gets taken down, the app won't continue to serve that page. It'll see that, but I never actually copy the image locally. So I just wanted to kind of show an example of it in action. But now what I want to do is I want to go into, actually let me show this real quick. Let me show what the kind of the results look like. So here's my tables effectively. So there's this like the wallpaper class. Let's start there. I'm going to go into details on all of this in a minute. So as you can see, each of these represents a column on the wallpapers table. So if we go into here and we open up wallpapers, you can see that those are basically a one-to-one mapping. There's also, oops. There's also foreign key constraints and the word is blanking. Junction tables. It sets up some of those as well as part of this whole process, and I'm going to get into more of that as well, in a little bit as well. But so that's why you can see these columns, and then there's some other stuff going on. So let's look at one more thing here before I go into the other part of it. So these are basically all of my migration scripts and that locks up. So the idea here is that as I do a as I create a migration, it creates the C# class, which will then run when Entity Framework is initialized in your app. So it doesn't run ad hoc. It will either run when it is initialized if you have a specific initializer set up, or you can run it ahead of time either through PowerShell with an update database command, which I'm going to show, or you can generate SQL and then actually just run that against your database. That's perfectly acceptable as well. If you don't want to run the code, if you want to do it with SQL. Yes, Blake?
So each of the migrations is really just a database update, right?
Yeah, so let's look at one real quick. So this is the initial create. So as you can see, I'm creating a logs table, which in retrospect, it was a bad idea. I should have just been using logging software. That's going to be deleted in a little bit. Then there's a wallpapers table. And can everyone see that all right? All right, cool. All right, so in this case, I'm primarily just creating this one. I'm creating two tables, but this is like the one that we're focusing on. So I'm creating this table, and as you can see, it's just doing this all in C#, and it will get translated into SQL when it needs to run against the database.
Can you see the SQL?
Yeah, let's do. Let me show that in just a second, because I want to show one more thing in here real quick. So this is the up function. There's also a down function. So that way, when you're going between versions of the app, so say you're running a production version of your app, you can then, your production version is probably going to be a few database versions behind whatever your current dev is at. So when you actually switch between the two, you can actually use the code first migration. It will know to go back down. It can go back down and go back up. Yeah.
So if you drop a column in the up, how do you get back the data?
So you don't. So you don't. That's why you want to be careful. So that's really for dev. You won't be using the down in production, presumably. So yeah, it doesn't store the data off somewhere. That's a good question.
But you could potentially modify these migrations to not drop that column.
Absolutely.
It's not gonna
Like if you wanted to make sure that down was never run, like if you were just like want to be ultra cautious, you could delete this and it wouldn't even, well, not while it's running. But you can delete this and it won't be an issue. In fact, when you run the migration, it's very important to look to see what it's doing, because if you're doing like a rename, or if you're accidentally deleting a property on your class and you don't realize you're doing that, it might be dropping a column. It'll be very obvious when I go to show you though. So these files aren't set in stone, they're modifiable. Alright. So let's go back to Brian's question real quick. And let me do So I'm going to run this. It's going to give me all the scripts. There's other commands you can run to pinpoint which scripts you want. Sorry? Yeah, so it runs. So you need the package manager console. Yeah. So it's right here. Let's go to data layer real quick, and then run this. Uh-oh. Thanks, Brian, for going outside the bounds of the demo.
Go to the future, man.
It's good. Oh, I forgot to give it migration. That's all. So the idea here is that you could set a source migration, and so that way you need the SQL just for a specific a subsection of your migrations. So as you can see here, we created this.
You have to downgrade it first? Or something? You have to like take it back a version?
Oh yeah, you know that is exactly what. Let me set the source migration. Oh, that's why I had that. Let's do this. You have to set this to 0 to kind of say like from the beginning. So as you can see, this is the SQL that it generates. So first it makes sure the migration history is there. That's internal to Entity Framework. And then basically it goes through it, iterates through each one and does the SQL to create it and modify it. So that's kind of the script that comes out of it, Brian. All right, so let's move on to the other project. So first, what I'm going to do is I want to show this does not have a migration set up. So right now, if I ran this, it would generate a database. Actually, let's just do this. So I'm going to run this real quick.
Well, this is starting up. Is there a particular project type in Visual Studio you have to select to get started
No,
with this?
that's a good question. No, all you have to do is use a class library,
Okay.
and use Entity Framework, probably from NuGet, if that's your thing. So I created this little page real quick. So in this app, I had to go here to instantiate the model. So this is the model. So this is basically your acting database. And if we look very quickly here, if we look at the post controller, you can see that a new new model context is instantiated when you go to the posts page. And so when you do that, it will then generate a new database. So we come up here, refresh. We can see the local variables DB exists. And if we look in it real quick, we will see that it should, it's two tables, that migration history and the posts. And the post just has an ID and a body. And so if we come back to the posts, and we add, let's just say we want to add, so let's say we want to add this. So by doing this, I'm adding a column. All right. I do not have migrations turned on right now, though. So what's going to happen when I go to run this and go to that post page again? We're going to get a lovely error. So as you can see, invalid operation exception, the model backing, local variables model context has changed since the database was created. Consider using code first migrations, yada, yada, yada. So the idea here is now that when I try to change the database that already existed, the database context didn't know how to handle that. It doesn't, because I don't have any kind of migrations turned on, and the model context is very strict on saying the database and the model in the code have to match. It helps a lot by doing that. Good safety mechanism. You can turn that off too if you want, if you're so inclined. So let's do this though. So let's undo the change I just made. And let's do, so just to show how cool this is, look, I'm just going to blow this database away. But it didn't change anything. If we refresh it, I'll show you. See the stuff column is not there. But let's just delete this database because any framework just makes it so easy to recreate it. All right. So let's do this. Let's set up the migrations. So I have this nice little cheat sheet in comments that I always put over my model context. So the first thing we want to run is enable migrations. So we're going to run that in PowerShell, or the package manager console, and we're going to set the default project to the data layer, because that way by making that the default project, it can find this DB context right here. All right. So we're going to call enable migrations, and what this is going to do is going to create a single folder right here. We just created it, and it creates a configuration file. So that's it. That's very simple. So if I change my mind, I don't want code first migrations. That's all you got to do. It's gone now. No more code first migrations. Ta-da! Code first migrations again, guys. All right, so let's look at the configuration file. I tend to leave it in its current state, so that you can set different configuration values here depending on what you want to do. For example, some things are maybe you want the tables to be generated in a specific way, like plural or not plural, stuff like that. That can take care of that for you. You can do stuff in here to kind of take care of that. The other thing that's going on in here is it says automatic migrations enabled equals false. If you turn this on, then you will not need to make migration scripts. There's a entity framework expert named Julie Lerman, who Exact Time has contracted with her in the past. I actually hit her up and said, when's a good time to use automatic migrations? And she's like, a good time to turn that to true is like when you're doing like a hacking project for the weekend, where you don't really care what's going to happen with the database, because you can't keep track of those changes if you do not leave that false. Because what will happen is every time you run it, oh, it sees a column change, sees a new table, loses a table, it'll just roll with it. It won't care. And what will normally happen with this false, the way that it is currently, it will complain and say, hey, you need to add a migration. They're actually, from my understanding, they're removing this in Entity Framework 7 because of all the confusion around this, so you're not even going to be able to use this feature later anyways. The other thing we're showing in the configuration file is this seed function. What it'll allow you to do is basically seed your database with initial values, like add or update. You shouldn't be using this in any kind of like business sense. It will blow away data if you keep the seed on. So for example, if you add something one time and someone modifies it, and then you go do this again, it'll just rerun this. So I haven't used this, but there's plenty of very valid reasons to use this. I just haven't personally come across it. Yes?
You said if they run it again, like a second value would be put in for it, or it just reruns everything to the database?
From my understanding, what it'll do is basically if there's any kind of indexes, it'll try to update it if it can. Otherwise, it will add it. So if you like the name Andrew Peters, so if Andrew Peters is not the key, then I think it might add it a second time. I haven't used it, but this is a way to seed your database if you wanted to. And this is called when you call update database, which I haven't gotten to quite yet, but I'm about to. So we created the first configuration. So what we want to do now is capture the database's current state. So what we're going to do is we're going to run this nice little add migration command. And we're going to say, I'm just going to call it initial. And so what this is going to do is it's going to check the current state that it knows about, and then create a class over here. And so it doesn't know about a current database, so it just adds what it sees. It adds the ID and the body. So this is the first script. This is the initial script to say, this is the current state of the database. What it also does behind the scenes is it creates this designer and regex file. I'm not going to go into great detail on that, but the idea here is that the regex file has a binary representation of your model, and it will compare that, and that's how it knows whether your database is out of sync or not. It's important to know that for team environments, because if you and a separate team member are doing updates separately, but at the same time, one model is going to have one person changes, the other person is going to have separate changes, and then when that gets merged up, then the database is going to complain and say, hey, I see 2 tables here when the most recent model says there's only 1. The way to fix that is to call add migration again with an empty script, and that will fix it. I believe EF7 is taking care of that as well, because part of the reason that those models exist is because of the automatic migrations. So let's add a so let's show off the power tool real quick. So there's this nice little tool to kind of show off your database model. So this is an extension I added. So there's this Entity Framework Power Tools Beta 4. It's been Beta 4 for like 4 years now. I don't know. I've not seen anything other than Beta 4. Well, this will do a few different things, but the one that I use, that will be good for if you have like database first and you want to transition to code first. It'll check your database first, or your database, and then create all these C# files, or the C# classes like post here for you. So that's a good stepping stone if you want to get into this. Let's look real quick at this though. So because I added the Entity Framework power tools, beta, whatever, I get this menu item now, and so I can see view entity data model read only, and it can show me my table structure, which in this case is very, very simple, but this can be very useful. You can't modify it from here, but you can kind of make sure that the layout is what you expected. And that'll make more sense shortly. It's like an episode of, or it's like that, what's that movie where the guy loses his memory? Yeah, it's like that right now. You'll find out about it in a minute, right? All right, so I added the first migration. So now if I do update database, it'll take my database to the state of the migration. So it applied the migration, and then it says running seed method. So if I had anything in the seed method, it would have used that right now. So if we look back here, we can see that the local variables DB now exists because I ran update database. So what I want to do now is I want to add a new column to the post class, for reals this time. So I'm going to say required. So that's how you make this non-null. You only need to use it on things that are nullable in C# in the first place, string being one of those. In my social desktop project, I didn't realize that when I first was setting this up a couple of years ago. So you'll have seen required on everything, like including ints and enums. That's not actually necessary. You only need it on nullable objects. So okay, now we have, not body, I want to do title. So let's do title, and let's say we can put a max length on it if we want. There's already a max length on the body. The body can only have 4 characters, whatever. All right, so I'm going to run this. Now I'm going to run add migration again. Added title. And then now that I've added title to my POCO that represents the post table, now we can see on the up there's an add column for title, and it's saying that it's not nullable. And on the down it just removes that column. So let's run update database. As you can see here. So now we have title, not null. And so here you can kind of see, you can start to kind of see the power of where you can check in your migrations. Other people can pull them down. They don't need to run SQL. They don't need to run anything special. You can have them run the package manager console, or you can set up your database so that it will automatically run. So for example, on social desktop, if I were to create a new migration, I wouldn't necessarily have to say add update database, because I set a setting so that when it runs, if there's a new migration, it'll just run on the fly. I don't remember if I had that on in production or not, but you don't need to. You can run straight up SQL in production.
Is that a configuration option in that configuration class?
It's a configuration option, but I believe it's in a different location. Let's just look for 2 seconds, I will tell you. Because it is pretty useful. I think, yeah, so it's not in there, it's in
the initializer?
Yeah, and I set the initializer in I made a database config. So I have this little, so it says database.setInitializer, migrate database to latest version for my social desktop model context, and look for this configuration class to kind of figure out where to get started. So yeah, I thought to myself, I'm doing this in I think I might do this in production, modifying the database, the user that's accessing the data, and also that same user can update the tables. There might be a problem there. It's a security risk. So that's why I kind of spelled that out for myself to think about later, if I don't want to worry about that. But you could, I think, actually, okay, so I don't have that in debug. I have some other stuff in debug. But yeah, so I have this running either way. So that is the option on how to set it that way, if you'd like. So let's go back to, so now I showed how to create a new column. So now I want to make another table. So let's do that. So I'm going to go to class. I'm going to make a comment for said blog for the post. So make it public. And so let's just say that in this I want the body of the comment. I don't care about who wrote it. I can worry about that feature later. So when you're creating this, so I'll do required prop string body. So now this is just the text that is there. We need a key for it. So one thing that Entity Framework Code First does is it has the idea, there's a convention. So if you say int ID, then it will automatically assume that that's the key for your table. It'll assume that it's auto-generated, and it will assume that it's incrementing by 1.
What about GUIDs? Just out of curiosity.
You can do GUIDs as well. There's a little more, I believe there's a little more work in setting it up because you just have to kind of spell that out, because by convention it expects an int, but you can do that. I think a friend of mine, he accidentally was doing auto-incrementing on the GUID, and he's like, man, this database, it has 3 GUIDs in a row. I was like, the chance of that happening, that's pretty unlikely. Well, let's go see what's going on there. It was auto-incrementing the GUID, so nice. All right, so then what we want to do, though, is Entity Framework has this really nice thing, these navigation properties. I'm sure all ORMs have something to this extent, but this being one of the only ones I've used, I really enjoy this. So let's do this. So we want many comments to one post, right? So what we want to say here is we want to say public post. Let's say virtual, and I'll explain why in a moment. Post, get set. So now I am tying. I'm saying this comment is only ever associated to one post. And then what I'm going to do is go on the other side and go to the posts and do the same thing and say, oh, we want to make it required too, actually. Because we want to say that there's not going to be, all comments are going to be attached to some post. So now let's go back to the posts, and let's say iCollection, no, virtual, iCollection, comment, yep, and we're going to say comments. So now we're saying that this post can have 0 to many comments, all right? One more thing that's good practice is have a constructor and initialize comments to an empty list so that when you're running link on it, you don't have to ever worry about whether it's null or not. So ReSharper likes to complain about virtual member calls and constructors. I like to tell ReSharper to shut up about this one thing. So what we have to do one more thing to actually make this a database, to make the comments a database table. We have to go into the model context. And so you can see here I have this db set posts. So now we need to make another one that is comments. Oops. All right, so now by doing this, we've now set up the comments table. And we've given it a body, and we've associated one comment to a post, and one post can have many comments. But we have to now call add migration, otherwise it'll bomb when we run. So
the DB context, what you name that, is that what it's going to name the table?
right here?
Yeah.
Yes, so that is going to be what it's going to name it. And you can do different things. You can, there's ways, so you can set nearly anything that you name as a property in here for the tables, the columns. You can rename all of those, or you can map them to different names. Say you have in your tables, maybe you have the table start with TB underscore, but in here you don't want the property to be TB underscore. You can set that. You can have that associated on here. So like we have right here, I believe it's table, yeah. And then so that way, if you wanted a specific table name, or if you already have a specific table name, but you want a different C# object, you can do it this way too.
Do you name your post table comments and your comment table posts?
Yes. I am not going to. All right. So let's run add migration and make sure what we expect happened. So add migrations, added comments. So let's see. It created the comments. So it created the comments table, and then it added an ID, body, and see, it automatically added a post ID so that it can create that foreign key relationship. This is something that you don't have to worry about. You can if you want to. We could have also come in here, and we could have also said public int post ID, and that would we could also see that relationship if we want to. I don't care. I'm just going to use the navigation property, which is this. Let's kill that. Come back here. So as you can see, it creates the primary key, the foreign key relationship, and the index. Now, if you want to change anything here, you can. So a good example of where that might be the case is if you use date times. For whatever reason, it uses, in SQL, it just uses the date time, or the, there's like two different data types.
There's date time and date time 2.
Thank you. It uses date time by default. It's super annoying. So you can change that to date time 2 if you'd like. So there's different things you can do in here if you'd like. So instead of running update, I'm going to instead delete what I have. So actually, before I delete it, so because I have not run update database, you can see here that, let me go back up to tables. You can see here that the comments table does not exist yet. Just because I've added the migration doesn't mean that it's modified the database yet. There's that two-step process, so that way you can verify what you want goes into the database. So let's say this is not what I actually wanted. Let's say instead that I want you to be able to have your comment be on many posts. So let's have a many-to-many relationship. Call me crazy. So let's do I collection. So now what we're going to do is we're going to have a many-to-many relationship. Let's rename this the post. All right. So before I do this, I want to show you. So I just changed this again. So I'm going to say, what I should do is I should delete the added comments migration right here before I do anything else. But I'm not going to do that. I want to say changed. Let's say add migration. Let's say changed comments. All right. So remember, the database has not been updated yet, but I want to do this. It is going to complain. Unable to generate an explicit migration because of the following explicit migrations are pending. And it shows you which ones have not been run against the database yet. So that way, if you try to add too many in a row, or if you try to add any number in a row, it won't know how to be able to synchronize. It'll tell you that you need to be able to run the migrations. Or that you need to update your database first, I'm sorry. So let's go back. Let's delete comments. So I'm just going to do this, delete this one. And it's as simple as that. So I didn't add the comments table yet. I didn't do anything. I realized right before I did it, right before I went to the database, I wanted to change it to an I collection. So now what I do is I'm going to go back up. I'm just going to say added comments again. So now, because I'm doing a many-to-many relationship, so it's going to do a little bit. It's going to do something a little different here. So as you can see, it created this. It created the comments table, but it also created a junction table post comments. So you don't ever have to worry about this because you don't really care about this junction table. You really just want it. It needs to be there to be able to keep your database, your foreign keys in check, right? So you can do this to take care of that. I just have this. I just have two. I have an I collection on this side, an I collection on that side, and now it creates that table in between for us. All right, what else? Let's see. I want to show you, I'm going to update the database with this. Come back here, we're going to see that the posts and post comments are now there. Sometimes it does this where it just seems to, it's a Visual Studio thing. It's kind of new, actually. I might need to clear my cache. We can just ignore that. But now what I want to do is I want to come back here and look at the data model again. Oh, hold on, let me just restart this. Oh, look, I figured it out as I was closing it. It was a byproduct of closing it. It wasn't that it just figured it out. I've seen that a few times now.
So you're saying, have you tried turning it off and on again? It does work?
Yes. So now we can see a slightly more useful model. We can see the many-to-many relationship between these two tables. It basically just, it ignores the junction table because you can see our many-to-many relationship. So let's see. I want to go back to, I want to revisit virtual real quick. So, like I said here that you want to make these virtual. I'm going to go back to this project and show you why. So I'm going back to my my other project that has a little bit more going on. So let's go to the web. Let's go to settings. Alright, so one thing I'm doing here, so I say using, and I create my new model context, DB, right? So that's what I'm going to call it. So when you have navigation properties, they're lazy loaded by default. And the way that they can be lazy loaded is because of that virtual keyword. So when you put the virtual around it, it basically it's kind of like think of how with mocking languages you kind of can change functionality. You can put like shims in between, and you can kind of change what's going on. Basically, what's going on is when you have these properties, when you have these foreign key relationships, it basically creates a shim. So going back to the post and comments example, so if I load up a post, but then I don't need to load up the comments, it's not going to load those into memory. But if I do need to load up the comments, then what it's going to do is at the time I grab the comment, it's going to then execute the SQL. You can get around that if you want. You can either make your property not virtual. You can set a configuration to say eagerly load. You can also do a dot include at the time of generating your link query. There's many ways to do that. One thing that's important though is that you have to do it within the context of while this DB exists. It doesn't attach to the DB specifically, but it does behind the scenes. So if I have user settings, let's see what navigation properties are on it. So I have this favorite wallpapers. It's a favorite wallpapers class. So if I try to call, well, it's not going to work because it's scoping. But if I try to call user settings outside of the creation of the DB, it will fail if you're trying to do lazy loading. If you have eager loading and you have it in memory, it's not going to be an issue. There's quite a bit of nuance going on to the different parts of Entity Framework. It doesn't take too much time to figure it out, but there is some gotchas, like the eager loading versus lazy loading. The idea that you have to do those kind of commands within the context of the database. Since I haven't actually shown it yet, let's look at one SQL query, and then I'm actually about done. I don't even know if this is a good example. I'm going off book. So here's an example in the user settings. I wanted to eagerly load a few of these things because I knew I'd be using them immediately. So as you can see, I'm just doing a dot include on the different tables that user settings is associated to, and then I'm grabbing just one user setting that is associated with whatever user is logged in. So that's kind of what I wanted to show for this. I didn't want to go too much into the details of how Entity Framework as an ORM exactly work. I didn't want to go into the details of link, and I didn't want to go into the details of doing different operations with the database. I primarily wanted to show off the power of Entity Framework, of the code first migrations aspect, the idea of kind of lockstepping your database to code and kind of seeing the power that can generate for your projects. So let's see.
Yeah.
Do you have a question?
No.
Okay. So, all right. So again, I'm Charlie. If anyone is interested, I'm interested in part-time consulting gigs. So I'm just throwing it out there. I also have a survey that is a 4-question survey. 2 of them are demographics questions. So it's real simple. I want to get better at this. So if there's anything that I did wrong, please tell me. If it went all right, please tell me that too, because I don't want to only get blasted on the survey. If I did all right, if I didn't do good, I want to know. I'm going to put that up on Meetup as well, so you don't have to worry about remembering that link if you don't want to. So are there any other questions? Yeah.
I have a question. For the MVC framework, don't you usually try to load your DB outside the controllers? Don't you want to keep your controllers as thin as possible and not really do the DB loading inside of it and probably create the repository outside and then call as needed, or?
Well, so, I'm not sure I quite understand. So,
Well, what I meant was, inside of your controller, you're doing a DB, like, you're doing something with the database. I mean, I've been hearing a lot of people say, oh, you should do that outside of the controller. You should do only things that control, like, what you're gonna show the view inside of it. You're not supposed to, but I haven't really figured out a way to do that, though.
yeah,
I think the issue is more like having data access calls directly inside of your
Control.
FBC project. Like, there's you have to do your data access sometime between when
The controller's called.
when the controller's called and the action results returned to the client side. So you're inside the controller
Yeah.
text, inside the controller method.
Yeah.
When that happens, inside the scope of that. Sorry, Charlie, I didn't mean to stop on that.
No, it's-
I think I knew where he was going.
Yeah.
So you have to be within that scope, but the idea is you want to create some tiers so that all of your data access is abstracted down to another layer, which Charlie's data layer project creates that
Yeah.
kind of abstraction. And then you
Yes.
know, if you want to add another layer of not making the MVC project have to know as much about the database, you can use some interfaces and use like IOC to inject your data layer, your data classes back
Yeah.
into that. So there's ways to invert that so that the MVC project doesn't necessarily need to know. And the full coup de grace that makes it really interesting is using things like MEF to dynamically load some of that stuff in, and then the web project doesn't even need to know. Like there's a really clever way to make it dynamically load DLLs, and then you can.
I personally like it a lot simpler, and
I'm just saying the ultimate like perfection of architecture that people try to get to.
I disagree. That's okay.
There's something that people consider like where your entities are completely devoid of any other.
Yeah, and so to go back to your question, I'd like to show you this real quick. So in my data layer where I'm setting up, I have this idea of these repositories, and these repositories are where I'm doing all of the different business logic of getting stuff out of the database. So basically, kind of like think of these as like your stored procs, so in a sense. Oh, so these are basically the business logic that is grabbing and loading the entities. I like this. It's very simple. It's very easy to follow. There's no levels of indirection. And if you don't mind coupling yourself to Entity Framework, then this is a very simple way to go. I personally, like in my experience, I've used Entity Framework, and I do not expect to leave Entity Framework. And if I did, there's going to be a large undertaking in that anyways. And so I'm all right with the way I've coupled myself to this. So I hope that answers, between Rob and I hope that answers your question. If not,
I'm just wondering, why would you create the repository to get the context, if you're going to do the context call within anyways? Why do you bother with the repository, just call the context directly and then use all the access to all the objects right there?
The functions have to kind of exist somewhere. They're either going to exist in my controllers, or they're going to exist, they have to exist somewhere. And so if they exist in my controllers, if they're private, then that means that they can't be hit by the outside world, but I also can't unit test them. If they're here in this repo, then I can make them public and I can make them easily unit testable.
They're also reusable.
Yeah, they're on good point. They're very
if you
reusable
need to get a
across
full list of posts from different controllers, from different controllers and different actions and different controllers, you want to be able to not have to write the same boilerplate, go get all the posts code. Just write one method, do it one time, and I mean that's why we abstract things out this way. The repository pattern is a pretty well known and well accepted.
Yeah.
Good idea. I mean, it's often considered a best practice.
Yeah, there's a few different ways to go about that. As you can, if we go back real quick, I'm passing in my context into the repository.
Yeah.
I've also seen people instantiate the context within the repository, and now you're coupling it, and you can't chain the different repository calls together, because you're making short-lived DB context per each one, rather than being able to call your different repositories and have them concatenate potentially a single query.
I'm assuming that allows you to do transactions then as well.
There,
Like if you need to hit multiple tables, it's an atomic transaction.
Well, yeah, you can do your atomic parts. I was kind of thinking of like the idea of the transaction rollback and stuff.
That's what I mean. I'm talking about like
That
if
using
you have
block,
access
you go
to
using block, that is
Yeah.
your transaction, right?
Yeah, the using block is the transaction.
I may have missed that earlier.
Oh, it's in your controller through tab.
Yeah, I'll just do this. Oh yeah, okay, good call. So this is effectively.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, here's another odd question.
Yeah.
I've been hearing about this, something called domain-driven design. How well does MD framework fit in with that? I know the repository pattern is part of that, so is CQRS, but
I guess I'm not as familiar with the term domain-driven design.
What's the basic?
There's some stuff on the
definition?
plural side about it.
Is there?
In fact, Julie Lerman did some videos about it.
Oh, did she?
she did? I
Yeah.
thought you did the, no, it was another guy who did the MD framework one, a plural site, wasn't it?
There are multiple people
doing
that do the
and
same
you found
thing.
it on the website. Julie Lerman's one of them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I thought it was right. I don't know. It's been a little while. I could be mixing it up. Anyway. Yeah, I'm a little fuzzy on the domain-driven stuff, but I seem to recall there being an idea of using multiple contexts for different, like, one context for each domain. Because the contexts don't necessarily have to go to completely separate databases. So one context might include, tables that are relative to, I don't know, accounting or something, right? And another context might go to the same DB, but only include the tables that are relevant to social media or something.
Yeah. Yeah, with that in mind, you can. So I'm actually doing that in Social Desktop. I have two separate different contexts. This is the one that I use for all my business logic, but I also have one that MVC provided for user authentication. So if we go to web, I just left it here for the time being. We go to, where is the? Yeah, it might be.
Control
Yeah.
T context.
Application DB context. So the application DB context, that is the same database, but this is all the application user, the identity management portion of C#. So I'm doing that in the sense that I have all my user information, like the user ID GUID and the login information. That's all within this context. And then when I don't have a foreign key relationship between between application DB context and the social desktop context, but I am using the GUID that is generated off this application user and using that same user for the user settings. So that way, when this gives me my instance, it gives me my user, then I will then get the rest of my user settings and the wallpaper and everything outside of my other contexts. Any other questions? Yeah.
How often do you actually see a shop, say, that has a well-defined DBA and developers actually choosing code first?
I have not. So I've primarily been using Entity Framework on all my projects at home. At work, we were using, on our older project, we were using code first migration, but we were still kind of doing it where we were reverse engineering it by doing stuff in the database, generating the code first models, and kind of going that route. And so of the places I've been, I've not seen that. I believe Microsoft is using it to some degree at least, but I can't speak about that. So.
Now, what about testing? Do you test the migrations at all? Or,
I do not test the migrations.
I mean, you kind of expect them to work well.
Yeah, what we've been talking about, we've been talking about at work going to code first migration. Right now we're not using any kind of updating scheme or any kind of automatic updating scheme, and so we've been talking about going to code first migration. But as one of the requirements, we don't want to have breaking DB changes. So what I was probably going to do is I was probably going to create a unit test. Well, just a test that happened to be run in the context of unit test. People have different opinions on what a unit test is. I don't think this is personally a unit test, but it needs to go somewhere. So what the test is going to do is it's going to scour that migrations folder and looked for any drop tables or drop columns in the up of the migration, and then basically spit back an error and say, hey, you probably shouldn't be doing this right now. And then what we're probably going to do is we're going to add like a, hey, this migration has been flagged for being okay for having dropping columns, dropping tables. But otherwise, there is no unit test. I'm curious, now that you say that though, I want to go and look to see if they're virtual. Because part of the DB, so entity frameworks evolved quite a bit. The original versions of entity framework it was not easy to unit test them. The DB context made most or near, if not everything, virtual, so it could be testable. So I'm curious if those are. Let's look real quick. No. Wait. No, it's not. The up and down are virtual, but no, it's not. It wouldn't be easy to mock it out and say, hey, this was called, this wasn't called, kind of thing. Any other questions? Yes?
I feel like I remember a while ago you had said something about code-first migrations not working very well in large team environments.
Yeah, and so there was question around how that worked with so when we talked about that, I didn't quite have it all figured out about how it works in team environments, and that goes back, I had mentioned it earlier where if you're in one branch and someone else is in another branch and you guys are separately making migrations, that binary model is going to be out of date with each other. So then when they get merged, there's going to be one binary model that kind of trumps the other ones. And the way to get around that is by calling add migration and then name it like merged or something. And what it'll do is it'll create a blank migration. You'll see nothing in the up and down for it, but what will happen is it'll create a binary model. The binary model will be updated for it. So if we look right, so this will basically have it fixed. I wonder if I can open this. But yeah, so see this is a long string that represents we're done here.
Alright.
Yeah, so
What would conflict about two simultaneous migrations? Like if someone checked, or two people check in at the same time, what's going to conflict there?
well, okay, so
Oh, just the binary? you're
yeah,
saying?
just that like that differential. So
You both rename the same column or something else.
There'd be conflicts,
Right.
but you could bold out a table and then
if you had
you need to
separate
resolve
tables,
the actual
Yeah.
binary that represents that.
So for example, like say you and I,
Mhm.
so say you're working on one branch and you create the authors table,
Yeah.
and I'm working on another called like social media table, right? So that binary model will see, okay, on mine it has a social media table, it has a comments table, it has that blog table. It will not see your authors table. And so then what will happen is on yours, it'll see the authors table, the comments table, and the post table, but it won't see the social media table. So then when they get merged up,
It's all
one of those migrations is going to be the last migration.
So what if they both make an authors table with different columns?
Yeah.
How do you merge the binary file?
So then at that point, you need to reconcile the POCOs to figure out who's is going to win. And then what you need to do is you need to call add migration and then update that database.
Then you delete out the binary block, right?
No, you don't mess with the regex. You can delete out the migrations that are causing conflict. So like if we introduce the same table and we were doing it differently, then what will happen is you're going to want to delete out some of those migration files right here, and then downgrade your database to the migration that is kind of like the last true one, and then update with your new migration script.
I guess in practice we really don't run into that scenario at work though.
Yeah,
We create the
normally.
exact same table at the same time, I mean.
Yeah, normally we have that figured out, but I mean it definitely could happen.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But
in practice for us it has not.
yeah.
I can see something weird happening. Yeah. We both end up making the same table. The same.
I can see making changes.
Or it's
to
the same
table.
column, or
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, different names, yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, any other questions? So like I said, I don't have a ton of practice in environments or in team environments with this. So that's why I know a fair amount about it, but I don't know all the different edge cases because I haven't had a chance to practice with anyone. I really wish I did, but no. But we might soon. So yeah, any other questions? All right, well, thank you. And